Have you ever had the experience of not being able to see something even when it's in plain sight? Well, it happens a lot in our house. So let's say one of us, let's call him, person A, will say something like, "Where's the lid for this lunchbox?" And the other person, let's call her person B, will reply, "It's right next to it." Now this will result in a few minutes of person A staring at the shelf while discontentedly muttering until he, or rather they, give up and call person B to find it. And they, will immediately see it. Sound familiar?
I can't remember.
Well, it happens to all of us, even very, very occasionally to person B. And the object we're looking for might not be quite where we expect it to be, or we might be tired, or more likely in a rush. And the result is that our brains just don't send the signals to say, "There it is." Well, it's been bugging me that in our story today, along with other stories about Jesus's post-resurrection appearances, the people who knew him best just couldn't see him, even when he was right there in front of them. Look at verse 4 of the passage that Stan read to us. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. Perhaps the early morning sun was in their eyes, or perhaps they were tired, they'd been out all night, or maybe they were just too fed up to see straight. Or what about that story of Mary Magdalene on the morning of Jesus' resurrection? Remember, she's come to prepare his body for burial, but the body's not there, and she's too overwrought to do anything except weep. So along comes Jesus, but until he says her name, she just doesn't recognize him. Later that same day, we've got the two disciples who were walking home to Emmaus. They're actually talking about Jesus. And they're giving all their attention to what's happened over the previous few days, including the incredible stories that they had heard passed around that he'd risen from the dead. But when a stranger appears beside them and asks them to tell him what they're talking about, they were, well, the passage says, they were kept from recognizing him. It was actually Jesus, the object of their conversation, right there in front of them, and they couldn't see him. Well, for all of them, too much has happened. Too many things have shattered their perceptions, and they're just too caught up in the moment to see the truth, that Jesus is alive, and he's actually talking to them. Well, what's going on in these stories? I think that a prayer I hear and read every day might give us the answer. It says, "As I enter prayer now, I pause to be still, to breathe slowly, to recenter my scattered senses upon the presence of God." I love that, particularly that phrase, "recenter my scattered senses upon the presence of God." I know that my senses are so often everywhere but where they should be. My phone will be buzzing with notifications, and the news is clamoring for my attention. I see the long thread of emails which need answering, and the washing up that needs doing, so that my sight is focused on too many things at once. My hands don't know if they should be sorting laundry or bashing the keyboard. I can smell the lavender outside, which is calling me to go and sit in the sunshine, and I really, really need the taste of a chocolate biscuit.
Of course.
Of course. But both a sense of duty and a partly hidden but still conscious desire to be with God are also calling me to pick up my Bible and pray. So before I can do that, I need to sit still, to breathe slowly, and to gather up those scattered, overburdened senses and recenter them on the presence of God, so that all those other things fade away and I can hear his voice. I love it that Jesus' friend Martha knew this. She doesn't feature in the Easter story, but she makes an appearance just before it when her brother Lazarus dies. Now, sometime before that happened, she had been too busy buzzing around doing domestic stuff to listen to Jesus, and he'd called her to be still and to spend time with him instead. And I think it's because she had learned that lesson that when Jesus belatedly appears after Lazarus' death, she can declare with perfect assurance that I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. At the worst moment of her life, her senses were completely centered on the presence of God. And she recognized that the one she needed most was right there in front of her, asking her to trust him and giving her peace.
If you like, because their senses were so scattered by the trauma of their circumstances, each of those involved in the resurrection story initially missed the reality of the risen Jesus because they missed some point about it or another. Mary mistook Jesus for the gardener, perhaps because the idea that he was risen seemed too good to be true. Cleopas and his friend on the road to Emmaus misunderstood the scriptures and needed Jesus to reinterpret them as he walked with them, still as yet unrecognized. Peter and the other 6 who went fishing in the story that Stan read for us were arguably misguided, understandably finding solace in the familiarity of their old jobs, fishing for fish rather than for people. So that when Jesus appeared on the shore cooking breakfast, they failed to recognize him. And the whole group of disciples in the upper room, hiding away for fear of the authorities, were missing in action, too afraid to make themselves known to anyone but those closest to them. I find it so encouraging that these situations of loss and confusion, hopelessness and fear, are the very situations that Jesus steps into to make himself known to his friends, even if at first they don't recognize him. Last Wednesday, I attended an online session called Emmaus Encounter, which was led by our regional ministry team leader, Colin Norris. It was a sort of 90-minute mini-guided retreat, and Colin encouraged us to take time to reflect on the Emmaus Road encounter between Jesus and his 2 friends. If you remember, as he joined them, he asked what they were talking about. And they were astonished that he didn't seem to know what had been happening, and he compounded their astonishment by then inviting them to tell him, well, what things have been going on. And Colin invited us to apply the story to our current situation and imagine that Jesus is now asking us, what things have been going on in the last 13 months in your life? And what struck me as I reflected on the story is that at the time that Jesus asked that question, as far as Cleopas and his companion were concerned, he was just a very friendly but rather ignorant stranger. It wasn't until he broke bread with them when they arrived at Emmaus that they recognized him. And with the benefit of hindsight, they started to recognize the signs that it was him all along. As they said, didn't our hearts burn within us as he opened the scriptures? In other words, what struck me was that just because they didn't recognize Jesus did not mean that he hadn't been present with them and ministering to them from the moment that he joined them. And the same applies to Mary on a much shorter time scale. All the while she thought he was the gardener, Jesus was present with her, just waiting to reveal himself with one compassionate utterance of her name. And likewise for the 7 fishermen in the story that Stan read for us. They didn't recognize Jesus until they hauled in one of the 2 best catches of their lives. Surely it was the realization that Jesus had done this before, which prompted John to cry out, "It is the Lord," and prompted Peter to leap out of the boat and wade ashore. But Jesus was already there, whilst still unrecognized. He was engaging them in conversation. He was asking how their night's work had gone, and he was pointing them in the right direction to help them get some fish. And of course, he was starting to prepare the barbecue. All of these resurrection stories show us that Jesus is not only present when we finally come to our senses and recognize him. With the benefit of hindsight, we can realize that he has been there with us all along, as Stan so helpfully pointed out in his testimony. For many of us, the last 13 months have been a relentless slog of going in and out of lockdown, of trying to grapple with ever-changing rules and guidance, and coming to terms with the impact of the pandemic on ourselves and our family and our friends. Many of us may have been asking, where is God in all of this? Where is God in the untimely death of friends or loved ones? Where is God in the loss of jobs or stability? Where is God in the isolation of not being able to find comfort in meeting up with friends and family? Where is God in not being able to worship him in song like we normally do? We will all have different variations and expressions of those questions, and we will all have different answers to them. But the important thing to note from these resurrection encounters between Jesus and his friends is this. The point when the risen Jesus reveals himself to us in whatever way is special for us is the point at which we have an opportunity to recenter our scattered senses upon God. Because it's then that we can look back with the benefit of hindsight in the certain knowledge that Jesus has been there all along. I wonder, if we were to do that now and reflect back on the last 13 months, in what ways might we suddenly realize that Jesus was present with us after all, and we simply didn't recognize him because in our loss or our confusion, our hopelessness or our fear, we simply couldn't see him? Perhaps there were moments when, like the Emmaus Road disciples, your heart burned within you because you at least realized that something good was happening. Why not take the chance to remember and to identify those moments and to give God thanks for the ways in which he has been helping us, whether we've realized it at the time or not? And as you do so, may your experience, may our experience be the same as Stan's, as we allow those memories and realizations of Jesus' presence to rekindle our faith in him.
Well, when you've done that, if you've got any stories about how you've realized in hindsight that God has been with you, helping you, and you're happy to share them, we would really love to hear from you. And perhaps, like Stan, we could even record a short testimony with you that would encourage others who are listening. But now, as we respond to what we've been thinking about, we're going to ask God to open our eyes so that we can see Jesus as we sing, "Open the eyes of my heart, Lord."